Ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start to this second last session of the day. I emphasize that it's only the second last, so there's another one to go after this one, so the sooner we get started, the sooner we get finished, and the sooner we can go and have that lovely conference dinner tonight. This session is on the topic of decentralization and governance. And our first speaker, I'll introduce each speaker at the time they're about to present. Our first speaker is Dr. Blane Lewis, who's a consultant who is based in Jakarta. He moves between academia and consulting work, especially with the World Bank, previously with the Harvard Institute for International Development. And he's also held positions at Cornell University and at the National University of Singapore. Nobody told him about Canberra's weather, and so he's sitting here going like this, and so be kind to him. He's feeling very cold. Blane Lewis.
Thanks very much, I think. I'd like to thank Hal Hill, first of all. Where are you, Hal? Are you here? He just stepped out, of course, for inviting me. I'd like to say that I was not, in fact, at the very first Indonesia update, nor have I ever been to an Indonesia update until just now. So, perhaps more importantly, this is my first trip to Australia. I've lived in Southeast Asia for about 20 years now, and this is my first trip, so I'm happy to be here, and I thank God I can now cross that one off my bucket list. The second thing, preliminary comment, I'd like you, if you have your brochures, to turn to page 14. And I'd just like to say that I'm not, in fact, a convicted felon. I don't know. I'm really a very happy guy. Okay, Scott is laughing. He knows, in fact, in some countries I am a convicted felon. Okay, here's my presentation. It's on the basically on the fiscal aspects of decentralization in Indonesia and their impact or lack thereof on service delivery and the reasons thereof. This is the outline. The presentation will actually have 45 slides. It's very long, and I wouldn't be able to get through that in my 20 minutes of fame here in this presentation, so I'll skip around quite a bit. I'll give you some words, a brief history of decentralization, although that was covered in the earlier presentations by the previous speakers. Look at in the context of the history of decentralization, we'll look at some fiscal outcomes, and then we'll look at decentralized service delivery outcomes as well. Provide a synopsis of those. Standard rationales for the deficient service outcomes, as I would like to call them, and an alternative explanation, that is my explanation, and some near-term policy reform agendas and some conclusions. Since time is short, and since I tend to dwell, to go on a little bit, I thought maybe I'll give you the outline of the argument up front, and so you can keep that in the back of your minds as you're listening to me go on. The basic argument is that I think decentralized service delivery outcomes since 2001 have been not so great. I would say that they are mixed across sectors, health, education, and infrastructure, but that generally speaking, the outcomes on service delivery have been rather disappointing. I don't want to talk too much about this because Coco is going to talk a little bit more about service delivery outcomes later. The question is, why have those service delivery outcomes been rather weak? If you're involved in the policy discussions in Indonesia, most people tend to focus on supply side kinds of considerations. The level of funding in the aggregate, the level of funding for various kinds of transfer mechanisms, the ways in which those revenues are distributed via their allocation mechanisms, whether it's neutral, too neutral, not neutral enough, whether there are incentives or disincentives in the system, and also on capacity issues. My view is that those are not the main reasons for deficient service delivery outcomes. I think the major concerns, the major constraints on in this regard are accountability between the subnational level governments, Kabupaten Kota, and their citizens. And in particular, because you think of accountability, you know that there are sort of a couple of different dimensions of it. There are appeals from citizens or demand from citizens for improvements to service, in theory, and then there is the response of local governments. My view is that there is a lack of demand by citizens for improvements to services. And this gets a little bit to Marcus's earlier argument about the levels of satisfaction of citizens. We'll find that citizens in Indonesia are actually very satisfied, to all intents and purposes, with the current service delivery outcomes. So that's the argument in a nutshell. That kind of gives the argument. If you look at the history of decentralization in terms of the legal and the regulatory framework, it goes back all the way to law number 5 of 1974, as I think Anne mentioned this morning. That's really where the idea of decentralized service delivery started. You can see that it was a long time between then and when the decentralization laws were actually written. An interesting anecdote, I guess, is when I first came to Indonesia in 1991, I was working with the Harvard Institute for International Development in the Ministry of Finance, and I saw a draft of what was to become Law 25 of 1999, dated 1985. And it really wasn't that much different, actually, from the law that came out in 1999. So you see that these things sometimes take a long time. We know about the political imperative of decentralization. As Marcus mentioned this morning, I was actually sitting in the Ministry of Finance when the decentralization laws were being rewritten, and it was very clear that Habibie initiated the whole idea to keep the country together. We were worried in the wake of East Timor of losing Papua, Aceh, and Kalimantan, East Kalimantan to a certain extent. So the purpose was explicitly political. Everybody knows about laws 22 and 25 in 1999. They initiated the so-called Big Bang. The laws were revised again in 2004. It became 32 and 33, and there's Law 28, which on regional taxation. It may be useful for you to know that the government is now in the throes of revising these legislative regulatory instruments again. There are draft revisions to laws 32 and 33 floating around already. They won't get much further until after the elections in 2014. But soon thereafter, one would expect that the regulatory framework would be revised again, at least at the margin. Everybody knows about direct elections, both at the national and the subnational level, and when that occurred, so I won't go over that. So here's a slide that shows the importance of decentralization starting in 2001. This slide shows spending at the national and the subnational level. Spending is net of subsidies and interest payments at the national level, and subnational level it's, provincial and Kabupaten Kota. So you can see it's about 50-50 now, net of those subsidies and interest payments. This shows real Kabupaten Kota revenues and expenditures from 2001 to 2009, I guess. We don't have more recent data. 2010 and 2011 data will be coming out shortly, but not yet available. You see that it's been in real terms. There have been some fairly. There was a major increase in 2003. And then again 2006, I guess that is. And that's largely a function of the increase in the DAU. The interesting bit, I guess, there is that late 2006 and 7, I guess, you'll see that aggregate expenditures actually became larger than aggregate revenues. During the previous years, revenues had always been larger than expenditures at the subnational level, and so this implies a buildup of fiscal reserves, Kabupaten Kota, and then by 2007, 2008, in the aggregate at least, local governments started to draw down on those fiscal reserves. If you were to show this graph out in subsequent years, you would see revenues becoming larger than expenditures again, and local governments have therefore started to accumulate surpluses. This shows the surpluses. You see the, maybe a bit hard to decipher that top graph there, but those are month-to-month fiscal reserves of local governments. You see two things. One is the pattern that during the course of the fiscal year, local governments tend to build up their reserves, and then they spend it all the last quarter, essentially, the last several months. If you look at that bottom point in each of the years, that gives you the level of fiscal reserves at the end of the fiscal year. So you can see the large buildup until, I guess that's 2009, 2007, 2008, and then you can see the drawdown, and then it has now started to go way up again. So local governments have started to save more of the money that they have. Now these these savings are in general fairly well concentrated. If you look at the bottom graph, that shows you on the bottom the numbers of local governments ranked in order from highest to lowest reserves, and then the level of reserves on the vertical axis. You can see that a very small number of local governments actually hold the bulk of the reserves. Who are those local governments? Well, they tend to be of two kinds in the aggregate. They are either large metropolitan areas, or they are kabupaten and kota in the natural resource rich areas. So that's who's holding the bulk of the reserves. You can see the top 10 here, and I guess they hold about, well, nearly a third of the total reserves. So it's large cities, and it's places in Kalimantan, Riau, Papua, and Aceh to a lesser extent. If you look at it in per capita terms, that's the bottom one there. That's you'll see that in per capita terms, at least, the reserves are held in large measure by Kabupaten and Kota in East Kalimantan. So per capita terms, they're the places that are getting rich in reserves. This shows another aspect of decentralization, is central government spending in the regions, much of which goes illegally to decentralized local government functions. This is as a percent of local budgets, I guess. The blue line, or you tell me it's green, I'm actually colorblind. The one there on the left, I get the big one, is deconcentrasi, and the little one, I presume to be red, is tugas pembantuan. That's money that goes to the district level. So these give you some indication, as sort of a proxy in a way for central government spending in the region on decentralized functions. It turns out now that the central agencies are bypassing even this mechanism and spending directly out of their budgets on subnational functions. So this, in a way, kind of clouds the picture of decentralization. This shows the percentage of total revenues by source. The main point is the importance of the DAU, although it's declining a little bit in its relative significance from about 70 to 60% of total budgets. The DAU is the block grant, I guess everybody knows. All the other sources of revenue are less than 10% on average. That's the revenue sharing, either taxes, natural resource revenue sharing, other revenues, and the DAK, the special purpose grant. So the DAU dominates. This gives a picture of the, two different pictures of the spending of subnational, of district Kabupaten and Kota. So you can see where is the money going. The first is according to, the top one is by sector, and the bottom one is by, well, object or function. You can see that in the top one, administrative spending has been typically quite high. That's very high internationally, although it's declining. It has been declining a little bit in recent years. Education is important, and health and infrastructure are less important. Education, the law is that local governments must spend at least 20% of their budgets on education. That is including salaries, so that's really not much of a hurdle to get over anymore for local governments. On the bottom there, you can see the major importance of personnel spending, although again that's been declining. That from many perspectives, is probably still a little bit too high. And you can see the spending on other kinds of functions there as well. Material spending is quite low. Capital spending is, not bad. 30%, 25, 30% of budgets these days has been increasing quite a bit over the years. Okay, here's a bunch of pictures I have stolen from various colleagues at the World Bank. It's intended to give a general impression of service delivery outcomes across the major sectors, education and health. I think the stylized fact in education is that on the good side, enrollments have increased by quite a bit. At least in the non-primary sectors. Primary school enrollment was already near 100%, so there hasn't been much of an increase there. But pretty large increases in enrollments across other levels of education. But that the quality of education, the word is, has been deteriorating a little bit, depending on what you're talking about, at least not improving much. You see that reading hasn't been doing too bad, but math and science scores have been deteriorating. This is on the famous PISA scores, the International Standardized Test, from which Indonesia now may be withdrawing because it doesn't like the way these outcomes turn out. This, again, is education. Again, I won't go through the details, but the major idea is that Indonesia's performance, I guess, is sort of in the lower middle range of other countries in the region and internationally. This is a picture in health. You can see that immunization rates have gone up pretty well, but that child nutrition, is the picture I've got here, has actually deteriorated some and stagnated. The other fairly lousy outcome on health is maternal mortality, which has gotten worse since decentralization by all appearances. This shows where Indonesia is in general in the region. You can see it's still fairly middling, I guess, in performance. A little bit better in health than, say, India, on par with some others, but generally sort of at the bottom of the league, or at least the bottom middle of the league. Here's infrastructure. Again, it's sort of a good news, bad news story. On the good side, the length of roads in Indonesia has gone up by a lot. This is mainly the kilometers of rural roads, has increased quite extraordinarily since decentralization. But the overall quality has deteriorated. And this is rural roads. This has unfortunately nothing to do with urban roads and congestion as such. On the unambiguously miserable story, I think, is on access to water, which has declined since decentralization by a little bit overall, and has gotten quite a bit worse in urban areas. So for infrastructure, the story is probably the worst of the three. You could see here's another picture of where Indonesia ranks internationally in its infrastructure outcome. Indonesians are very, very thankful for the Philippines, so that at least we're not that bad. Okay, so what are the standard rationales? How am I doing time-wise? Oh, sure, now you're way over there. 5 minutes left? Surely you jest. Okay. Okay, let me cut to the chase. I'll send you the paper, really, if you're interested. There are three, I think, very common arguments that you hear about the reasons for the not so great performance on the service delivery side. Local governments, of course, say that we haven't got enough money. And some line ministries also agree with that point of view. Of course, they want the money in their budget so they can spend it. But the general idea here is that local governments are underfunded, poor local governments, and therefore service delivery is bad. I think this is an incorrect argument, generally speaking. If you look at regionally, at least, local governments in Indonesia are actually very well funded. It's around between 5 and 6% of GDP. It's much higher than, say, the next ranking one in the region is the Philippines at around 4.5%. If you go to India, on a per capita, on a percent of GDP basis, third-tier municipalities in India get only 0.5% of GDP. So Indonesian kabupaten kota get an order of magnitude more money than India. There is, however, a certain rationale about lack of access to, I'd say, debt finance in Indonesia, which is a very true thing. It's not clear that it's actually a lack of access to sources, but Indonesian local governments do not like to borrow much. They prefer to get their money for free from the central government. The argument that the lack of capacity is the main problem, I think, is also a little bit exaggerated. It's something that's much harder to measure, but in general, I would say that in my experience, local governments have quite a bit of capacity. In other words, they could be doing more with what they got. Certainly, this doesn't apply to all kabupaten kota. There are some that are very capacity constrained, but in general, I think this is an argument that doesn't hold a lot of water. It's a favorite argument for some donors. Why? Because they have capacity building programs. The final argument that you often hear is that the system of transfers somehow disincentivizes local governments and also treats all local governments as if they were the same. I think there's a certain truth to all of this, but I think it's mainly the main outcome is a mismatch between fiscal needs and fiscal revenues. And since revenues have very little to do with outcomes, it's not clear to me, at least, how this particular aspect of the system constrains service delivery. There is some truth to the argument that there are very few incentives in the system for improved performance, and that is something that the Indonesians might choose to work on. Okay, so my explanation for what really matters in terms of poor service delivery is a lack of accountability at the subnational level, and this is largely a function of the satisfaction of Indonesian citizens with the level of service delivery as it exists already. Some quick facts here. We did a large survey, the Governance and Decentralization survey in Indonesia several years ago. Found very high levels of satisfaction with health and education and administrative services, 78, 90, and 85. Uh-oh, Ross is going to give me a card here. Time is up almost. 1 minute, okay. So very high levels of satisfaction, and only 7% of Indonesians had ever complained about the level of service or the quality of services. And the reason that the other ones didn't complain, over 90%, was because they already thought services were pretty good. Only 30% of Indonesian households indicated that they would like to have better services and pay for them. So this is the argument in a nutshell, is that Indonesian services are satisfied. We could go into the reasons later if you'd like as to why they are satisfied. But if they're satisfied with the level of services, this means that they are less likely to appeal or demand improvements in services. They are less likely to hold their local governments accountable for service delivery, and therefore local governments can get away with being corrupt and lazy. There's nobody demanding that they improve their services. Let's skip the policy agenda. It flows in a rather straightforward manner from what I said before. The supply side stuff may be important to work on, probably not the most crucial aspect. My own view is that citizen education is probably a way that we would like to go more, although that's hard for donors and international institutions to do for a variety of obvious reasons. I guess I'm out of time, so there you go.
Thank you, Blane. I confess I was so fascinated with the presentation and sitting way over there that I kind of let the time slip myself, so I apologize for that. Our next speakers, it's a panel, Arianto Patunru, my colleague here at ANU, and Erman Rahman from the Asia Foundation. And Erman is going to start off the presentation, I understand.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you very much for Hal to invite us here to make a presentation. And to me, this is my first participation in the Indonesia Update. So I wasn't here 31 years ago. I was born 31 years ago, but I wasn't here 31 years ago. And this is like a joint presentation of Arianto, Acho, an economist, and myself, an engineer by background. So referring to Philip's statement in the morning that if like a political scientist really becoming like hating the object of their research, engineer even run away from their subject and learn do something else. So today we are going to try to present like basically the topics of local governance. So first, my presentation will be discussing the progress and issues on local governance in general in Indonesia. And then I will talk more about the things that Blane and some others have been discussing on local budget allocation, spending, as well as the execution issues. And then Acho will do more difficult stuff, try to analyze the link between this the impact of local governance, local budget policy, and other factors to development outcomes, especially on expenditure per capita and HDI growth. And then we will conclude and try to identify some policy implications. Okay, on local governance, actually I think as other speakers have been talking about, we are in general see like mixed results. Here we are using the data from the surveys that the Regional Autonomy Watch, KPPOD, and the Asia Foundation have been doing since from 2007 to 2011. We surveyed like 90% of the districts in Indonesia, whereby 50 firms, private firms in each districts are interviewed on their view about local economic governance. And four provinces out of 32, we excluded Jakarta, have been surveyed 2 times in 2007, 2008, and 2010, 2011. And as you can see in the graphs here, in the 4 graphs here, they're a mix, like on infrastructure as obstacles to the firm growth. We see in general things are, this is like the percentage of the respondents who say that the condition is important for them as an obstacle. So the higher the negative their view. And as you can see, especially in Aceh, the things from 2007 to 2011 is getting worse on infrastructure. Land issues as well in Aceh. I think Aceh is really interesting province as discussed in the previous sessions. While actually in other provinces in NTB and NTT, things private firms view that it's getting better, but in Aceh it's really getting worse. Similar with transaction costs, and also like business licensing, Aceh is getting worse, while others are some getting better, some think that it's similar. But in general, I think we cannot conclude that there is like improvement or things are getting worse in 2007 and 2010, 2011. Similar, infrastructure is the most important aspect of local governance in based on the perception of local firms. And as you can see here as well, I mean, like we don't see, this is like a perception of the quality of several types of infrastructure. Like in Aceh, again, in NTT this time, on the quality of roads, they think like it's getting worsened, like from 40% of the respondents to about 2/3 of the respondents, while actually in Aceh it's getting better. On water supply, in Aceh getting worse, in NTB it's getting better. on perceived electricity, Aceh, it was like the time when we made this presentation in Aceh. Every 5 minutes of my presentation, we have to cut because of the blackout. Like so, we really felt the problem on electricity in Aceh. But in East Java, for instance, it's getting better. This is like from 2007 to 2012. This slide, it's a bit crowded, but I try to we try to summarize like 3 interesting initiatives on local governance in Indonesia, which is basically trying to build the institutions on three aspects: on business licensing through establishment of one-stop shop service for business licensing, on electronic procurement services, the so-called SPSE, as well as on access to information through establishment of Provincial Information Commission, as well the PPID, the Information and Documentation Officers at the local level. First, it's interesting because the initiatives were initiated. These things were initiated by local governments themselves, which is like some of them were supported by donors, like on one-stop shop and also on access to information. But on e-procurement, for instance, Kota Surabaya basically started without any support from the donors at all. So it's really initiatives by local governments at the very beginning of decentralization, since 2001 to 2005. And then they were adopted by the national governments and through various ministerial decrees, presidential instructions, even law on transparency and access to information. And afterwards, like there have been like significant progress in terms of establishment of these new institutions. Like on OSS, for instance, like Ministry of Home Affairs claimed that 80% of the districts have been establishing the OSS, about half of the province as well. On electronic procurement system, almost all provincial governments have adopted it, like almost 80% of the local governments, and as well as like more than 2/3 of the provincial governments have already established these provincial information commissions, although on the PPID it's still like about 20%. But when we look in more detail whether these institutions really have authority to perform, and furthermore to look at the immediate outcomes of these institutions, we don't see such like a very exciting results. Like on ISS, for instance, like 31% of the OSS actually don't have authority to issue licenses, so it's like a very limited. And in the immediate outcome, like about 40% of the OSS, even like this is based on the official time to issue licenses, like only about 40% issue licenses longer than the national standard. And we can imagine if that's the official time, the actual time might be higher. And also like on the e-procurement, almost 3/4 of the districts only use the e-procurement only to announce the tender rather than accepting the proposals from bidders. And if you look the outcome of procurement, the level of competition is still low, as well as the efficiency gain from this reform. 1 minute left. Okay. Okay. So we also look at the BPK data. The results are very this is the BPK State Audit Agency opinion about the province and district of financial reports, and we see like a big improvement in terms of like opinions. Like the green ones are the good opinions, while the red and orange are bad ones. But our previous study also showed that like this BPK audit opinion needs to be looked at it carefully, because like the very high variations among the quality of audits among regions, as well among between years of audits. I will talk briefly about local budget policy and execution. I think it's very similar what Blane was talking about, but I'm using like more recent data, including the data from 2012 and 2013 on budget plan. And in general, in the real term, district revenues have not been significantly increased, especially in terms of transfers from the central government as well as locally generated revenue, PAD. But the significance of other revenues have been increased, particularly in 2008 and 2011. And this is driven particularly by these infrastructure funds, acceleration funds. And there are several issues in this infrastructure development funds. And I think Blane referred to it as illegal. Like one is that it's really duplicating the DAK. And two, it's really lack of transparency. I think Ross made a paper like saying that the DAK mechanism itself is problematic, the way you use the term that you use. Well, this one is more problematic, and as you can see, there are a lot of corruption cases related to these infrastructure funds. Okay. 2 slides. Yeah. Okay. On the expenditures, I think basically what's happening is like personal admin expenditures crowding out the development expenditures in the last few years, and also like just to respond to this morning discussion on health and education expenditures. Actually, at the local level, the education expenditure is quite huge, like it's 30%. To 40% of the local budget, while health budget is still very low and still at 10%. In terms of grants of village, it's not only like as the central government likes to provide grants to village, Scott. It's also like a district government. It's been increasing. And also one comment on this is like one important work by Scofias et al. Seeing like the results of election to the local budgets, which shows some positive results on the results of election to local budget. Thank you. I'll hand over to Acho discussing more difficult stuff. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Selamat sore Bapak Ibu sekalian. It's always good to presenting in Indonesia Update. So Erman and I wanted to test some of these arguments or assertion that he just presented. So we gather some data, and so this part are some tables. So please bear with me. This is a very simple econometrics exercise, actually. So what we are trying to answer are questions like the following. First, does good governance lead to better outcomes, or does good budget allocation lead to better outcomes? And what determines budget allocations, and also what type of districts get good audit opinions, okay? And these are the data that we use. We pick 2 outcomes variables, and that's economic growth and change in HDI. For economic growth, we use per capita consumption from Susanas. Of course, there's an option to use GRDP, but there's been some studies talking about the quality of PDRB data in the district level. So we use consumption from household. The downside of it, of course, we cannot capture components like government expenditure and investment and trade. For the independent variables, here we use good governance indicators that mentioned by Erman. That is the survey by KPPOD and the Asia Foundation. Neil McLeod has done some exercise on this for the first survey in 2007-2008 survey. In this particular study, we also use the most recent one, the 2010-2011 survey. And in addition to that, we also combine with budget allocation data that we get from the Ministry of Finance, and also, of course, the audit opinion from BPK that is compiled by our colleagues in Seknas Fitra. We control for initial condition, of course, the initial conditions in 2007. So we control for the consumption in 2007, access to, because this is growth type of regression, so access to good water supply, access to good sanitation are the proxy for physical capital. And for the proxy for human capital, we use access to education for junior high and above. And then we also control for administrative characteristics, and those are the age of districts. This is how we try to capture the pemekaran. So we have 4 generations in the data set. We call it generasi 0 for the older districts, and generation 1 are those who were established in 1999, and then there is a generation 2, 2001 to 2003. Generation 3 are those districts established in 2007 to 2010. 2008. Of course, there are more districts recently, but we cannot capture them. So there is actually generation 5, but we don't have it in the data. And then lastly, we try to also see the association between administrative characteristic and budget policy. We do not pretend to seek for causality in this model, so it's more of trying to find an association or correlation, if you like, of these variables. Sorry for the table. This table is here for me to keep track on what I'm going to say. So basically, I forgot to mention that the survey has index of good governance, and this index have 9 sub-indexes, okay? And then in our exercises, we found, this is a lagu lama, of course, infrastructure is always coming up very strong. So governance in infrastructure. In this case, this is for the economic growth as proxied by household consumption. We see here that infrastructure is very, very significant, but also to some extent interaction. We cannot explain why integrity, this is integrity, they ask the opinion of the respondents of the integrity and the capacity of the mayor and the leader, and this coming up negative in some of the models. Also here you can see that BPK audit, the good opinion are also associated with higher growth, higher economic growth, which is good. But in terms of budget allocation, you will see here that actually the higher proportion for personnel expenditure are associated with lower growth. So, but as opposite, it's the higher for the development expenditure. Here, the budget variables are the portion of, for example, development is development expenditure as portion of total expenditure. Person as a personnel expenditure as a portion of total expenditure. We also try per capita terms actually, but the results are not very different. In terms of pemekaran here, it's not very it's not common across all the models, but you can see here that district outside Java and Bali show higher household expenditure, and then Kota Madya exhibits higher growth than Kabupaten. Here for HDI, change in HDI, human development indicators. Again, infrastructure is there, but also some other component of the governance. So transaction costs, but license appears as a negative. We are still struggling to explain this. And also another mystery here is BPK audit. But we speculated here the reason why BPK audit has negative sign for the HDI model is that because of the correlation with opinion with the age of the districts and the pemekaran as well as the location of them. But here we also found, in terms of pemekaran, you can see, oops, here, CNU here actually is trying to capture the pemekaran, okay? And then you see here that newly established districts actually are associated with lower HDI growth. And again, higher personal expenditure as portion of total revenue are associated with lower HDI. And then we try to merge these two data. We cannot merge in terms of the indexes that constructed by the KPPO and Asia Foundation, because they are constructed in relative terms, meaning that all it's a function of all the responses from those. Okay, 1 minute left. But we try to use individual variables. In this case, we have difficulty to access land. Okay, so land licensing and so forth in terms of land, and then road infrastructure, and also the percentage of respondents saying that their leaders, either Bupati or Wali Kota, are corrupt. And then we find out that actually, again, land and road infrastructures are the one coming up very significant. Again, development expenditure is important, but personnel expenditure is actually not contributing to economic growth. In terms of pemekaran, newly established districts have lower HDI growth compared to all districts, just the same. Now we wanted to see what affects this budget allocation, budget policy. So we assume that the higher portion of development expenditures is a reflection of good budget policy, and while on the other hand, personnel expenditure as ratio to the total expenditure is actually bad policy in this case. And then we found out that newly established districts tend to have higher portion of development expenditure and lower personnel expenditure, and districts that split tend to have higher development expenditure and lower personnel expenditure. Time's up. So let me just go to policy implication. So this is the last slide. Again, the Lagu Lama infrastructure development is very important, but in relation with this improving budget transfer from central to subnational government, including streamlining the DAK formula and things like that, is very important. Procurement reform and creating incentives for then there might be, you might not see the relation with the previous slides, but we actually talk about this in the paper. And then the reduction of transaction costs, and we also support focusing on budget allocation, because in public finance management there are many aspects, one of which is budget allocation, and we support focusing on this. And also last thing is that be careful with the regional proliferation. We agree with effort to tightening the requirements for proliferation, and it's actually there in the new draft decentralization law. Thank you, Ross.
It's so hard being tough with a guy like Archo. You know, he's a lovely guy, and I'm thinking he's got to stop now. He's got to stop now. But such is life if one is going to be a chairperson. So our next paper is being, it's a presentation of Professor Gunther Schulze, Schulze, I should say, who is a professor of economics from Freiburg University, and Bambang Suharnoko Sharir, better known as Coco, is a PhD candidate at the same university, and they're going to be talking about the impact of decentralization on local public service delivery. Silakan, Pak.
Selamat sore, Bapak-Bapak, Ibu-Ibu. First of all, allow me to thank Pak Hel and Pak Budi for inviting us all the way from Freiburg. And it was very nice for us to be here. And my co-author and I, Professor Schulze, will present today our research on decentralization and democratization and how it impacts the public service delivery in Indonesia. So basically, this is, we're going to talk about decentralization and democratization in Indonesia I'm going to go very briefly on this because this has been talked about in the previous presentations. We're going to talk a bit about our analytical approach, and then we're going to talk about the way we look at the service delivery by looking at the inputs, the governance process, which is basically represent the technology of producing the service delivery, and then the output of the service delivery, and then we try to conclude. Right. Decentralization in Indonesia, we know that in 1998, Suharto stepped down, and then we have our first democratic election in 1999, which gave legislative power to the local parliaments. I would like to mention that in 2001, we had the Big Bang decentralization, as Pak Blane mentioned in earlier presentation, that we had a political, fiscal, and fiscal decentralization and administrative decentralization at the same time. Political meaning that now the local governments, the local parliaments now elect appoint the head of local governments after decentralization. And then fiscal decentralization, meaning that 1/3 of the budget is actually now transferred to the local governments at that time. And then administrative, meaning that the local governments are now responsible for planning, budgeting, and executing the budget and delivering the service delivery. And of course, then we have the start of the direct election of the district heads with the introduction of the direct election in 2004. And this means that the local accountability is strengthened with the direct election in 2004. And the other implication of decentralization is that the growing number of districts, the so-called pemekaran, and we have 292 in the beginning, and then we have 477 in 2002. In 2010, don't be alarmed if the numbers are different with the one presented by Marcus, because Marcus used the numbers by BPS. And if it's different with the one presented by Erman, it's because Erman used the one by Bappenas. And I'm using the one by Minister of Finance. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, they are different. Which is basically, our definition of districts is based on the number of districts that actually receive DAU in every year. So what we see in this slide is basically the number of districts are growing, and then we see the democratization process, whereas before we had the appointed district heads, and then with the introduction of the election in 99, and then after decentralization that they are allowed to elect the district heads, we have the indirectly elected districts, and then we have the directly elected district heads. By 2010, basically all Bupati and Wali Kota are directly elected. So, and then the nicest thing about this democratization process is that the timing of the direct election is actually predetermined, because it's not predetermined, meaning that it basically depends on the term of the previous Bupati or Wali Kota, which can be traced down all the way back to the colonial. So it's basically fairly exogenously determined. In terms of the fiscal authority, we all know that the local government actually gained a lot of fiscal authority. And in these graphs, I'm presenting the local expenditures of the Kabupaten Kota for 3 main sectors that are decentralized. And these are the 3 main sectors that we are going to focus on in terms of the service delivery. And they are infrastructure, health, and education. And as you can see, they increased significantly after 2001. And of course, we also have to bear in mind that the responsibilities of the local governments also increased significantly. However, if we look at the service delivery, in this case, it did not improve so much over time at the national level. And the 3 indicators that I'm using here is for infrastructure, we're looking at the village roads. For health, we're looking at the ratio of puskesmas per population. And then for education, we are looking at the junior secondary school per population. The reason why I selected these 3 indicators are very much related to the way we do the analysis later on. And I will explain it to you in the next 3 slides. But this is basically the pictures at the national level. However, if you look at the district level, you start to see some movement. Now, I selected this Kabupaten Kota to make a point that there are Kabupaten Kota that actually increase their education indicators after decentralization. There are Kabupaten Kota that are basically the same before and after decentralization, and there are actually Kabupaten Kota that got worse. So this is the picture for education. This is the picture for health. So the same thing happened. Again, this is the indicator of the ratio of the puskesmas per population. And then also the same thing if we look at the infrastructure. So yes, we see movements at the subnational level. Some districts do get better, some districts do get worse, some districts do stay the same. So our questions are, have things become better in general for the people? Do we have better governance? Do we have better services? Does decentralization actually deliver its promises that actually bringing decision-making closer to the people, actually create better preference matching, higher transparency or participation, or we experience what they call local capture? And then, of course, this heterogeneity of districts. Do we observe convergence or divergence? Of course, our methodological challenge would be is a missing counterfactual, because we don't know exactly how these districts, if the decentralization did happen. So we explain a little bit later about how we handle that. And this paper in particular, we are basically drawing on results from the existing empirical results by myself and a couple of co-authors, including Professor Schulze, but basically drawn from a panel data sets at the district level. We have 418 out of 477, excluding Aceh, Papua, and Jakarta, because Jakarta's decentralization is different with the rest of the country. It only stopped at the provincial level. And for Aceh and Papua, a lot of missing data, so we decided not to include it in our panel data sets. We create a balanced and unbalanced panel data, depending on the type of analysis that we do. Like, for example, to create a balance, we did collapse them to the original boundary definition based on the 2000 definition of the districts. We are focusing on 3 sectors: health, education, and infrastructure. And these are the levels of public physical infrastructure that we measure in our analysis. And the reason why we selected these indicators is because these are the indicators that are solely under the responsibilities of the local government. Local governments are responsible for the junior secondary school, the local governments are responsible for the puskesmas, and the local governments are responsible for the share of, local roads, basically, which in this case is proxied by the village roads. And of course, we have this timing of local election, which were exogenously determined. And we have results of the national elections, local parliamentary. We try to basically measure how this strengthening of local accountability and see how it affects the service delivery level. And also we have other controls that you can see in the paper that basically in the regression results. And the analytical approach that we use, we basically look at the 3 steps of service delivery. We start with the input, and by input we want to know, like, we look at the expenditure of the local governments in each of the sectors. These are the input to produce the service delivery. And for technology and governance, we have to think about it, because we want to create, we want to have a proxy that is available for all kabupaten kota throughout the period that we observe. And like, for example, the KPPOD had a nice survey that actually look at all kinds of aspects of governance, but they don't really cover all the kabupaten kota, and they're not, and cannot be used in a panel analysis. So we have to think about a proxy to do it. So we decided to look at the administrative spending, which can actually be a proxy of how efficient is the local government and whether there's a waste expenditure or not. And in terms of output, I explained already about the output, and we try to select the output that are actually represent the real responsibility of the local government, as well as output that changes over time that we can actually use in our regression analysis. So basically, this is the whole approach that we try in this paper. And basically, we are drawing the analysis from the existing research. Like, to look at the input, our research question would be, have decentralization and democratization actually affect the expenditure patterns for the core services, which are health, education, and infrastructure. So basically, we look at these dependent variables are the expenditures in these 3 sectors, and our main independent variables are the decentralization and the democratization, which are represented by the direct election and then the indirect election, and then we have some interaction dummies, and then we had the interaction with the service delivery level. And we used the balance panel from 94 to 2005, and we used the seemingly unrelated regression with fixed effect on these three sectors. And the results actually quite promising because we can actually show a significant changes in the way the districts spend their money on these three sectors. That after decentralization, they actually spend more in districts that actually have relatively low level of service delivery. However, we cannot identify systematic changes that are related to the democratization process that includes the indirect and direct election. Again, as I mentioned, to measure, to use as a proxy for the governance and technology in producing the service delivery, we're looking at the administrative spending. And I think Pak Blane has mentioned in his presentation earlier that government administrative spending is quite large. And Erman also mentioned in his presentation is actually about 30% in average, which was only second to education, which were about 30% in average. So way more than health and infrastructure. So we basically, there is a regression that actually look at what are the determinants of this administrative spending. We take into account, of course, the dependent variables is basically the administrative spending, and then we have in the independent variables, we have the technology variables, and then we also have the governance, the direct election, and then indirect election, that to try to explain whether or not the direct election and indirect election actually affect the level of administrative spending. And the result, and also we have the splitting dummies, where we try to we have a set of dummies that actually represent districts before it split, district after it splits, and for those who did not split. So basically this is to compare, to see whether or not there is a cycle before and after the splitting for both the parent district and then the child districts. And the results that we have is basically the splitting is not the main reason, but the lack of accountability is. Because after we're throwing in some political variables, we have that districts with lower political competition, for example, have higher administrative spending. And also, unfortunately, we cannot really identify systematic changes involving the direct election in terms of the size of the administrative spending, although we also notice that there is an increase in administrative spending for the direct election simply because they need to spend some of the money for the election, but it's basically we control for that already. So the next step is we look at the output. And in the output, again, we look at the three sectors. So we look at the share of villages with paved roads, and then we look at the share of puskesmas relative to the population, and then we look at the share of junior secondary schools relative to the junior secondary age children. And our research question would be whether or not we identify any convergence or divergence into the pattern before and after decentralization, and to what extent decentralization and democratization actually change the service delivery level, and then of course the determinants of them. And then again, we use the unbalanced panel from 94 to 2009, and then we use the seemingly unrelated regression with fixed effect on these three sectors. And the reason why we use the seemingly unrelated regression is to basically control from the fact that the decision making in allocating in these three sectors are basically interrelated. And then we have the synthetic counterfactual prior trend, which basically we look at the trend before, the growth trend before decentralization, and then we look at the growth trend after. And just to basically an illustration of the results, yes, in terms of pattern, we see that there is a convergence in the secondary education. If you look at the left-hand side is basically for the period before decentralization, and then the right-hand side is the period after decentralization. As always, the x-axis is the initial level, and then the y-axis is the growth for the period mentioned. So we notice that there is a convergence in secondary education, but not in health, and only slightly infrastructure, and it's only after decentralization. And the regression results also show that money does matter, so revenue does matter, and richer districts do provide better services, and decentralization tends to make things better. However, there is no uniform effects of direct election. It basically depends on the financial endowment. And in some cases, that the effect would be negative in the beginning, and then in our simulation, that it shows that the richer the district gets, the result and get more positive, the impact of the direct election. So, to conclude, we try to basically look at this in a systematic econometric approach to measure the effects of decentralization and democratization on service delivery. And we covers the first decade basically as the data available. Our main data is the local budget data that comes from the Ministry of Finance, and it's only available until 2009, but we also have the data for a previous period before decentralization. And then we also have this timing of direct election that actually play as our proxy for strengthening of accountability. We have this appointed district, we have this indirect election, and then we have this direct election. But so far the result shows that the democratic accountability is still insufficient. We cannot really have a conclusion that say that yes, it gives a positive. There is an effect, but not uniform. But overall trend tend to be a little bit more positive. So the effects we think may still unfold. So we are hoping that the best will come. Thank you very much.
Folks to come and sit yourselves down in the chairs there. Okay, same deal as before. We'll take a group of questions, and we'll take 3, and then we'll answer those. Okay, and booth first. Wahyu right up the back, and Bambang. Okay. Yeah. Can you move along?
Thanks. Well, I just have one very quick point of clarification, because a lot of the speakers talked about what they termed administrative expenses, which I presume is salaries and wages, but they didn't make clear, does this also include salaries and wages of teachers and health workers, or is that split out and put in with the education and health expenditures? That wasn't clear, perhaps it could be clarified. Second point is directly to the Schulze Shahria paper, and I really do have doubts about the indicators you were using. If I've got it right, you're looking at the ratio of junior secondary schools to the total junior secondary school population, and then the ratio of health clinics. You seem to be suggesting that a Kabupaten Kota, who just built a lot more junior secondary schools or health clinics, was somehow doing a better job with service delivery. But I think one could argue against that. I mean, perhaps fewer secondary schools, particularly in the more densely settled areas with larger enrollments, better quality teachers and so on, do a better job than having a lot of scattered secondary schools with presumably smaller enrollments. Ditto with health clinics. One of the criticisms that was made back in the Suharto era of the Impres Kesehatan, the Puskesmas, they built a lot of clinics, but they were poorly staffed, often no medicines at all, and they, you know, the local populations were obviously very disappointed with the services they offered. So it just seems to me, looking at numbers of schools or numbers of health clinics relative to population, doesn't adequately capture the quality of service delivery.
Okay, thank you. Wahyu, do you have a microphone?
Terima kasih,
Yes.
Bapak, Ibu, selamat sore. Saya Regi dari Bappenas. I have one simple...
I'm sorry. I was looking at Ibu Wahyu behind you, up the back there.
I thought you might change your name into Wahyu.
No worries, no worries.
My name is Wahyu, staff from University of Canberra. The presenters consistently mention about the cost of personnel, and I'm just wondering if there is policy implications about this, because in some cases, in some daerah, 60% of the budget goes of the DAU goes to personnel, and some, one or two in West Java, even all of them, or deficit even for just budget for civil service. So Blane has not mentioned quite clearly about the policy implication, and I would really appreciate if you could mention about this.
Thank you. Bambang?
Thank you. I was struck by the fact that the water access to clean water is declining, and I was just wondering whether it has some things to do with the failure of the privatization of the water utilities program, which the World Bank actually greatly endorsed in the 90s. And whether when you compare the services in various countries and it's got a mixed result, whether if you put in the fact that those water utilities in those places were part of this failed project has anything to do with the fact that it's got a mixed result. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Could we have something from Team Gunther first?
Thank you, Anne, for the question. We can tell you what this is here. This is administrative spending that we look at. So it is spending only that the districts spend on themselves. No salary for teachers, no salary for doctors, nothing that goes to the services itself, but rather the district's head offices and what the district spend on itself. That is 30%. That's amazing, right? 30% is spent on themselves. So we think this is waste, and we think that is something we should look at. And we did, and we tried to find out whether there's any improvement whatsoever, and we didn't find much, right? Okay, so that's one. And the other thing is, yeah, how do we measure quality of education? How do we measure quality of schooling? How do we measure all this? Yes, your criticism is right. It could be that the same level of school enrollment pertain to very different qualities. The problem of this is if you look into the field and let the data speak, and we have almost 500 districts, we want to have a cold look at the facts. Now we want to have a look at the facts that we can observe, and what we can observe is how many of the people that should go to school go to school. Yes, you could come up and say, well, but school is not equal school, they might be different quality. Then the question is, what do you do? Sit back and say, well, we can't say anything about it, or can we say, well, we have standard operating procedures. It is an indication that if we have higher school enrollment, things are getting better. And we subscribe to the second view. We look where we can look systematically, and we let the data speak. You can always level criticism against each and every single indicator. We provided a whole battery of indicators that we looked at. But the indicators that we're presenting today is those that are under clear authority of the districts. That's really important, so that you don't have that you have a one-to-one match between outcome and authority. And those for which you have consistent data throughout the years for all the districts, and that is one, and that has been used in the econometric analysis of education quality quite frequently. Your criticism notwithstanding, I think it does tell us a lot, even though there are limits to what it can say.
About the water project, that's you? You want to have
On the water, the deterioration and the lack of access to water, the simple answer is I don't know, but I'll take a guess. I think there are a couple of things. I don't really think it has anything to do with the privatization. That's my view, right? I mean, very little privatization has gone on in the water sector, except for in Jakarta, and services really haven't improved there much, although probably a little. I mean, I think a couple of things. One is that if you look at where access has deteriorated the most, it's in urban areas, right? I think a lot of that has to do just simply with migration. A lot more people are moving into urban areas. They're moving into areas that don't provide access to water. So it's an in-migration phenomenon to a large extent. Also, and although while I believe in general pemakaran hasn't had much impact on the quality of services, I think a sector in which it may have had some impact is water. Because if you think about how it's actually happened, if a kabupaten or a kota splits into one or more additional kabupaten kota, they don't always create a new PDAM, a water enterprise, for the child kabupaten kota, right? And I think this has caused some disruption in services, just the fact that there are new regions without their own PDAMs, perhaps. Finally, I think local governments have traditionally treated PDIMs as the kind of cash cows, right? They haven't supported much PDIMs. They have not invested in PDIMs. Instead, they have taken dividends from PDIMs where they could. I mean, there are lots of problems on the PDIM side as well, but I think this is one instance in which finance probably matters a little bit for the service delivery. On the question of policy implications for the DAU, I guess that was, and particularly with regard to its support for personnel spending. I mean, the stock answer for that is that the DAU formula has a special component called the basic allocation, which is used, the size of which is based on personnel spending. And so the general idea is that the DAU formula in general and this basic allocation in particular creates an incentive for further personnel spending. And I've been doing a little work on these perverse incentives embodied in the transfer system in general. And I have to say that the econometric work that I've been doing supports the idea of this perverse incentive as regards personnel spending. So I think the obvious policy implication is that when you're revising the DAU formula, you get rid of that bit that embodies the perverse expenditure. But generally speaking, at the end of the day, you've got a system that is fairly neutral with regard to spending at the subnational level. And you're not going to get spending the way that it should be until people start demanding improvements in the quality of spending. That's the bottom line constraint. If I could just follow up on Anne's point on the administrative spending. I mean, administration in this regard is treated as a sector, right? So it's like education, it's like health. That's how it comes out in the data. So there are no personnel spendings for education, for health, for other sectors in administration. As Gunther said, it's front and back office spending. The one caveat to what Gunther said, I would say, is that sometimes local governments use administrative spending as a catch-all for, they put things in there where they don't know where they should go. At least this is the defense that's often raised by local government officials themselves as to why administrative spending is so high. Oh, there's a lot of good stuff in there as well, is their point.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Just one comment, two comments actually. One to respond to Anne's question about the personnel expenditure, and actually in our graphs, in our slides, we include the salaries for teachers and health workers and everything. But if you see, I mean, that's exactly the question we have, because our NGO partners in Indonesia really like to use this development versus personnel. And we try to link it with this. If you see the two models that Acho was presenting, the model for the expenditure, this is like more the household expenditure is more significant. This increase in development and decreasing in personnel. To increase the rate of the growth of the expenditure, while on the HDI it's less significant, less so. So that's the like one thing. And on personnel and policy implication, I think, Blane, if I remember it correctly, they have removed the personnel in the basic allocation. They haven't? Huh? Oh, Bloom. So yeah, I support Blane for that. But actually, like one thing that we haven't really discussed in this conference is like all these new laws, draft laws, on not only on decentralization, on fiscal decentralization. There is also like one draft law on civil servants, law on civil servants, and also election of local governments, which really I think my sense is like really trying to re-centralize, like, and the Pak Eko Prasojo, the Wakil Menteri of the, what do you call it, the Menpan, the administrative, is really leading the new law on civil servants, and basically the policy that the way I see it is really like trying to centralize, re-centralize the civil servants recruitment, everything, in to really deal with this issue, which I'm not quite sure. I tend to agree with Blane on creating incentive rather than re-centralizing it. Thank you.
Because in TREE presentation we talk a bit about the administration spending, I thought just to give you a brief overview what exactly administrative spending is. It's a local government budget is designed by sector, and as Pak Blane said, it is a sector by itself, and the function and the items underneath it is very clear that it's for to administer government, because there's this pemerintahan umum with Sekda, DPRD, kemudian kepala daerah, bupati, kantor bupati, dan lain-lain. And then there's for development planning, there's a part for Bapeda, there's kesatuan bangsa dan politik, sumber daya masyarakat desa, statistik, komunikasi, informatika, all this stuff under administrative spending. And if you see in Erman presentation, or in Blane presentation, there's also an economic classification in each of the sectors that actually look at the staff spending, that look at the capital expenditure, and also look at the general administrative expenditure. So in this sector, within these sectors, you can actually identify the staff, you can actually identify the capital expenditures, and you can also identify the general, the operation and maintenance expenditures. Not really crystal clear, but yes, you can do it with the current local budget. Thank you.
I'm looking at the clock up the back, and it says almost 6 o'clock, and I think, gee, did we run that much over time? I think I trust my watch a little bit better. But okay, the boss has given me permission to take 3 more questions. So I saw a lady here, and then Phillips, and then Killian.
Thank you. My name is Rachel.
Very short, says the boss.
Yes, I'll be care to keep it short. My name is Rachel Cintron. I'm from USAID in Jakarta. And I had a question about accountability, which is really interesting, and it's directed particularly to Blane, but I also noticed that 2 of you had concluded that a lack of accountability was a major factor in some of these outcomes that you were measuring. And so, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a woman who complained publicly on like a Facebook page about the poor services that she received in a hospital. And as a result of that, she was prosecuted for libel and ended up having to go, to courts. And eventually the case was dropped because of public opinion in her favor, but not after, it took over a year for that to happen. And so I wonder if maybe, Blane, you might take a couple of minutes to expound a little bit more on the local systems of accountability and why it is that that citizens are not able to hold their public officials accountable. Is it a lack of really their opinion, or is it cultural? Is it a fear of reprisal? Is it a lack of systems to be able to give that kind of accountability to their local leaders? Or is it maybe like despair that they'll be able to affect change? So anyway, I wanted to give you that opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. Philip from Monte CSIS. This question goes to Pak Acho and Koko probably. I was wondering why there is very little information on the political variable. I mean, if we're talking about decentralization, I think we have to measure political competition at the local level. Koko mentioned briefly, but I wasn't sure what is the political variable. If I may suggest, if there isn't, I think we can take into account what we call in political science the effective number of parties. That's basically a fraction of the votes gained by each party to the ratio of the total seats or votes available, and then we can compare, and then we can throw in the variable into the regression model. That's only one suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Killian Nolan from the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict. I had a quick question for Pak Erman and Pak Arianto. I think you talked about a surprising negative correlation with BPK audits. Could you just explain what that was and how that worked?
Okay. Who wants to go first? You went last. last time, so you'll get first this time.
Thanks for the question on accountability. I mean, you know, I think it's really hard to generalize about why there is weak accountability at the local government level. I mean, you have lots of different cases. You have people who don't complain because I think that they are relatively satisfied. My own view is that they're satisfied because they have rather low expectations. There's a group of people who don't complain even though they are unhappy with the level of services because they don't think local governments are going to do anything about it. This is actually the category in which my wife falls. There's a third category of people who do complain and then don't get any response from local government, or like the unfortunate woman the well-known case, the woman who complained on her Facebook page about the health services, you know, are actively worked against. So, I mean, there aren't empirical analyses looking at accountability in this way in Indonesia, to my knowledge. My own view is that it's the first two categories that are most important, and it depends on where you are. If you're in, you know, Indonesia is a vast country. If you go to, if you take the country as a whole, you're looking at most people have lived where they have always lived. They are subject to the kinds of services, the quality that has been constant over their entire lives. It has maybe gone up a little, improved a little bit since decentralization. So I think these people see things that are not falling apart and that they are relatively satisfied. You get very high levels of satisfaction. Part of that, of course, is courtesy bias, I'm sure. But that notwithstanding, I think there's a large segment of the population that thinks that, hey, lumayan, yeah, things are not going that badly. And then the second category is also a fairly large one. I think that there are some high-profile cases of people who have complained and haven't gotten any response, but those are really in the minority.
The answer to Philip's, we don't have variables for political affiliation and things like that. The only, I think the closest one is Pilkada. We tried it, but it's not significant in all the models. I think Koko has party affiliation variable, so he can talk about it. On BPK, yeah, we should be honest. We are struggling with this, actually. For the economic growth, it appears positive. So association with between good audits and higher economic growth. But on HDI, the sign is problematic. So what we did, but that's only for the first set of survey, which is 2007, 2008. When we tested it for the 2010, 2011, it actually is insignificant. So maybe it's also about data quality. But then we also try to estimate some kind of simple logic estimation to see what kind of districts actually get good opinions. And I was rushing, so I didn't present it. But first, newly established districts are less likely to obtain good opinions. And our results, Kota Madya is more likely to obtain good opinion than Kabupaten. And then districts in Java, Bali are more likely to obtain good opinions. That's our findings.
The last word.
Okay, I'm going to be very quick, but Philip, yes, we do have the political parties variables, and we created political concentration index with it. We play around with the majority. We play around with whether or not the top party in each region actually, and then correlated with the results of the national party. So we try to play around with it, with the political party information that we have. And there's some interesting results that we didn't get a chance to present, like, for example, affiliation with Golkar actually increased admin spending, for example, that the, I mean, I'm not which is the result of the data shows that. So there is some interesting sort of stories when you look at these political variables, particularly when analyzing the government administrative spending. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, before I ask you to join me in thanking our large panel of speakers, can I ask, can I just say we're about to start on the last session for the day, so would the speakers and the chair please come down for that as quickly as you can. Please don't move around too much. We'd really like to get cracking with the last session as quickly as possible. Now you can clap.